Okay, so you want to own a shooting range. Picture the counter first: hot brass, gun oil, the low hum of a ventilation system working overtime, a flag bolted above the register, a line of regulars who show up every Saturday before the doors even open. Picture the sound down the lanes, that satisfying crack and the paper target reeling back with a fresh, tight cluster around the 10 ring. The veterans, the first-time buyers nervous about their own trigger finger, the instructor walking someone through their first concealed carry class. Now picture a city renovation crew skipping a single $184,000 part on a $17.8 million building project, and 7 employees testing positive for elevated blood lead within the year. That happened, and not to some backyard hobbyist, to a professionally run, government-funded range. The firearm and ammunition industry generates $91.65 billion a year in economic activity, per the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and yet the range itself often survives on a lane fee of $10 to $14 an hour. Here is the governing question worth sitting with. Why does a range open since before you were born become more valuable standing there, doing almost nothing, than a brand new one built at 3 times the price? The answer has almost nothing to do with how many people show up to shoot, and it's coming later, because that's where a huge amount of the real money hides. A shooting range is not one business. It's 3, wearing the same storefront. The first door is the retail-anchored range, a gun store that happens to have lanes bolted onto the back of it, where the range itself functions less like a product and more like a showroom nobody else in retail gets to offer. Try before you buy, except the thing being tried can put a hole through drywall. The second door is the membership club, dues-paying and community-driven, the kind of place where regulars know each other's names, and the business makes its money less on any single visit and more on a recurring charge that hits a card on the first of every month, whether that member shoots twice or not at all. Here's the part nobody tells you about the third door: the institutional range, built primarily to serve police academies, corporate security contracts, and military-adjacent training programs, where the walk-in public is almost an afterthought, and the real customer is a government purchase order. Some operators try to run all 3 doors at once. Most fail at that, because each door wants a different building, a different insurance policy, and a different customer walking through it. This breakdown follows the first door, the retail-anchored range, because it is both the most common entry point for a new owner and the one where the licensing data, the margin data, and the 2 documented failure cases available all line up. Retail is not a side hustle bolted onto a range. For most operators, retail is the business, and the range is the loss leader that gets people standing at the counter. There is also a chain that grew from 1 storefront to 14 locations across 7 states chasing exactly this retail-anchored model, and very nearly did not survive its own growth. That story is coming later, once the hidden costs below have had a chance to add up. So what does the price of admission actually look like? First, there is land, and land is the first filter, because most municipalities effectively treat a new commercial range application as something to be quietly discouraged rather than approved. Zoning ordinances built around discharge distances and noise complaints mean a parcel that looks perfectly viable on a map can die in a planning meeting that lasts 11 minutes. Second, once land clears zoning, there is the specialty build-out, and this is where a shooting range stops resembling any other retail construction project. According to Action Target, a commercial range builder, ventilation and filtration alone, can exceed $500,000 for a mid-size facility, because the air inside a range has to be engineered to keep airborne lead below OSHA's action level of 30 micrograms per cubic meter, with a hard ceiling, the permissible exposure limit, at 50. Cross that repeatedly, and the range is looking at mandatory employee blood testing and potential shutdowns. Third, layered on top of ventilation comes the bullet containment system itself, the backstop that physically catches every round, and the baffles, Angled steel panels bolted along the walls and ceiling engineered so that even a ricochet off a badly aimed shot never leaves the building. Combined range systems and specialty build-out, ventilation, containment, acoustics, target retrieval, stalls, safety infrastructure, commonly run somewhere between $500,000 and $5 million or more, depending on lane count. Fourth, almost an afterthought next to those numbers, is the federal licensing. A Type 01 Federal Firearms License, or FFL, the federal permit required to sell firearms as a business, runs $200 for the initial 3-year term. If the range plans to rent or sell suppressors and other items regulated under the 1934 National Firearms Act, a special occupational taxpayer registration, or SOT, adds another $500 to $1,000 a year on top. Fifth comes opening inventory, firearms and ammunition sitting on shelves, tying up cash before a single sale closes. Add it all together on an all-in commercial project, and the total lands by Action Target's own account somewhere in the multi-million-dollar range before a single customer has walked through the door. The building permit is cheap. The air inside the building is not. Here's the trap. Everyone budgets for the ventilation system once. Almost nobody budgets for what happens after it's installed, because a range does not buy clean air one time. It rents clean air continuously for as long as the doors are open. Keeping air changes high enough to hold airborne lead under OSHA's limits is a permanent line item, not a one-time capital cost, and industry estimates put that running cost somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 a year for a mid-size facility. Then there is the lead itself. Every round fired eventually becomes a physical liability sitting inside the backstop, and a range that chooses its reclamation partner carelessly can expose itself to serious hazardous waste enforcement risk. San Diego found this out the expensive way. The city's own police range shut down in May of 2022 after 7 officers tested positive for elevated blood lead, and the investigation traced the cause back to a single skipped part, a dust containment component that would have cost an additional $184,000 on top of a $17.8 million renovation. The city eventually settled with the county's Air Pollution Control District for $700,000 in October of 2024. No admission of wrongdoing, but the check still cleared. A separate range in Salt Lake City, operated by a local police mutual aid group from 1969 to 2019, left the city facing up to $3 million in cleanup costs after it closed, a bill that landed on taxpayers, not the operator. Insurance is the next character in this story, and it punishes exactly the kind of confidence a growing range chain tends to have. A single fire at one location can cost more than most owners take home in a decade. The Range Safety Officer, or RSO, the certified staff member responsible for enforcing every rule on the floor, can stop a shooting incident in seconds, but nothing on staff can stop an uninsured fire from becoming a balance sheet event. Labor is the quieter trap. The average hourly wage for a sporting goods retail salesperson climbed from $12.55 in May of 2019 to $15.12 by May of 2022, according to Shooting Industry magazine, a jump of roughly 27.5%, while the margins on the products those employees sell barely moved at all. Regulation is not a checkbox. A range clears once at opening. It is a standing tax on the air, the floor, and the payroll, paid every single month whether a single customer walks in or not. Now look at the other side of the ledger. Layer 1 is the obvious one. Lane fees. A walk-in shooter typically pays somewhere between $10 and $14 for a session, with premium lanes, electronic target retrieval, pre-programmed drills, pushing past $25. It looks like the whole business. It is not. Layer 2 is membership, the recurring charge that hits a card whether or not that member ever loads a magazine that month, And for an operator, a member who visits 0 times a year at $40 a month is a better customer than a walk-in who visits once and pays $14 for the privilege. Layer 3, and this is where real weight starts to sit, is retail. Firearms sold over the counter run a gross margin around 16.5%, compressed down to 8 to 14% on models bound by manufacturer minimum advertised pricing agreements known in the trade as MAP, thin but consistent, and gated at every transaction by Federal Form 4473, the background check paperwork every buyer has to clear before a sale is legally final. Here's where it gets interesting. Layer 4 is ammunition, the quiet workhorse of the entire model. Bulk range ammo carries roughly a 25% margin, slightly higher on specialty and defensive rounds, and unlike a firearm, which a customer buys once, ammunition is the product a customer has to keep coming back for, week after week, for as long as they own the gun. Combined, firearms and ammunition together typically account for at least 70% of a retailer's total dollar volume. Layer 5 is training, concealed carry certification classes running somewhere between $50 and $250 a head, averaging around $150, taught by instructors who are often paid a flat rate regardless of how the class actually prices out. Layer 6, smaller but higher margin per transaction, is the SOT side business. Renting or transferring suppressors and other NFA items to members willing to pay a premium for access most competitors legally cannot offer. So far, a shooting range sounds like a machine with 6 separate ways to print money, stacked one on top of the other, each one covering for the weakness in the layer below it. Revenue is not profit. Occupancy is not the same thing as income. And the layer that actually decides whether a range survives its first 5 years is not on this list at all. Read that again. The layer that decides survival is not on the revenue list. Here is the nested version of what's actually happening underneath a range's storefront. On the surface, the obvious product is range time, the lane fee, the smell of the gunpowder, the satisfying paper target. That is the bait. It gets people in the building. Underneath that, the real money room is retail, specifically ammunition, because a firearm is sold once and ammunition is sold on a loop for as long as the customer owns the gun. That 70% combined share of dollar volume from firearms and ammunition is not a footnote. It is the actual business model wearing a range as a costume. But that is not the deepest layer either. Underneath the retail counter is something almost nobody who walks through the door ever thinks about. The range's location itself has become close to impossible to replace. Remember the zoning barrier, the planning meeting that can kill a new application before it is ever built? That barrier does not just slow down new competitors. It functionally caps the total supply of legal shooting ranges near any populated area permanently, because municipalities that were willing to approve a range 15 or 20 years ago are, in most cases, no longer willing to approve one today. A range that has been operating since before that zoning tightened is not just a business anymore. It is a license to exist in a category regulators have quietly stopped issuing new licenses for, structurally closer to a taxi medallion than to a normal small business, valuable specifically because it cannot be duplicated down the street. That scarcity does not show up on any single year's income statement. It shows up on what a buyer is willing to pay for the building and the zoning approval attached to it, independent of whatever the lanes and the retail counter earned that year. The paper target was never the product. The ammunition was the business. The zoning approval is the asset, and almost no operator realizes it until the day someone tries to build a competing range next door and simply cannot get permission. Now watch what happens when those hidden costs stop being theoretical. Bear Arms, LLC is a real named firearms and ammunition retailer that also operated indoor ranges across the American South, exactly the retail-anchored model this breakdown has been following. The company grew the way most retail chains grow, one location, then expansion, riding the curve so many operators chase, from a single storefront up to 14 retail locations spread across 7 states by 2023, 2 of which included full indoor ranges bolted onto the retail floor. Then, on June 19th of 2022, a customer at the company's Huntington, West Virginia location fired prohibited incendiary projectiles down a lane. The resulting fire caused roughly $1.3 million in damage to the building. Here's the part nobody puts on the press release. The location carried no loss of income insurance, meaning every dollar of revenue that store would have generated while it sat closed for repairs simply vanished, uninsured, straight off the company's books. 11 months later, on May 15th of 2023, Bear Arms LLC filed its first Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It did not disappear. It restructured, kept operating, kept selling. But the scar tissue never fully healed. By its second filing, on July 21st of 2025, the chain had shrunk from 14 locations across 7 states down to 8 locations across 5, including just 2 indoor ranges, still owing $2.5 million to Burke and Herbert Bank and Trust and another $500,000 to the U.S. Small Business Administration, with additional claims stacking up from mall operators and retail landlords who had leased its space during the expansion years. Bear Arms is not a story about a bad business idea. The retail-anchored model worked well enough to get the company to 14 locations. It is a story about what happens when the hidden costs stack gets treated as optional. One uninsured fire at 1 location out of 14 was enough to trigger a bankruptcy filing that took over 3 years to fully play out. 14 locations at its peak. 2 Chapter 11 filings within roughly 2 years of each other. That is the failure rate this industry rarely puts on a thumbnail. So why do some ranges survive fires, bankruptcies, and margins this thin for decades, while chains with 14 locations do not? This is the answer to the question posed at the very beginning. Why an old range sitting quietly can be worth more than a new one built at 3 times the price? It has nothing to do with revenue, and almost nothing to do with how many members walk through the door in a given month. It has everything to do with zoning acting as an accidental scarcity engine. Every regulatory cost already covered, the ventilation engineered around OSHA's lead limits, the discharge distance ordinances, the insurance steep enough to bankrupt an underinsured operator overnight, functions, in aggregate, as a wall around the existing supply of ranges near any populated area. New operators face that wall in full. Existing operators, grandfathered in under whatever rules applied when they opened, do not. A range's zoning approval is worth more than its cash register, and it is not close. A range that has held its federal firearms license and its zoning approval for 20 years is not competing against hypothetical new ranges, because in most markets there effectively are no new ranges being approved to compete against it. It is trading in a supply that the industry's own count, 10,976 shooting range businesses nationwide, according to IBISWorld, growing at just over 2% a year, even as demand for the underlying product moves in bigger swings than that, suggests is not expanding anywhere near as fast as it could. The wealthiest operators in this business are not the ones with the busiest lanes on a Saturday morning. They are the ones sitting on the oldest zoning approval in the zip code, aware that the permit itself, not the shooting, is the asset actually appreciating underneath them. Now, watch what that scarcity does to a single year's numbers. Picture one mid-size retail-anchored range, 12 lanes, built for somewhere between $1.8 million and $2.4 million including the land. In a rough year, membership dips because a competitor 2 towns over undercuts pricing. Walk-in lane revenue lands around $310,000. Retail and ammunition combined bring in roughly $640,000 at compressed margins. Training adds another $95,000. And against all of that sits a ventilation and compliance bill running somewhere between $140,000 and $190,000, insurance premiums that jumped after a regional claim spike, and a lead reclamation contract, paying out only 60 to 80% of that day's LME, the London Metal Exchange benchmark price, for the lead recovered. That still costs another $60,000 net. Total revenue lands around $1.05 million. Net, after payroll, debt service, and the full hidden costs stack, the range clears somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000 for the year. Rough year? Now scale that same 12 lanes across a great year. The floor runs a cold range policy through peak hours, meaning every firearm stays holstered and unloaded until a range officer gives the command to begin, which keeps throughput safe as membership climbs past capacity into a waiting list. Walk-in revenue reaches $410,000, retail and ammunition together clear $890,000 because a regional ammunition shortage pushes prices and margins upward at once. Training adds $140,000, and the same fixed compliance costs barely move because they were never tied to volume in the first place. Total revenue lands near $1.55 million. Net comes in somewhere between $310,000 and $360,000. Great year. Read those two numbers side by side. A rough year clears perhaps $55,000. A great year clears over $300,000. The difference is not the lanes, and it is not the members. It is whether the fixed hidden costs stack got covered by enough retail volume to stop eating the entire margin. Picture the counter again. Hot brass, gun oil, the flag over the register, the regular who has shown up every Saturday for years without missing one. None of that was ever the product. The lane fee got the door open. The ammunition kept the lights on, and the zoning approval bolted to the paperwork. Nobody in that building ever thinks about was the actual asset the whole time, appreciating quietly while everyone underneath it argued over $10 lane fees and $25 VIP lanes. The range was never really the business. The permit to exist was the business. If you want to see how the same math plays out inside a private prison, that video is on your screen now.